Good morning. We are going to be heading downtown to the Colorado State Capitol because today's topic we are talking about, I guess, bureaucracy, technically. Um, we're going to be talking all about self-sabotage and how the education system, the government, political movements, environmental movements, we're going to be talking about how movements sabotage themselves by getting wrapped up in a bunch of useless, pointless bureaucracy-ness. We're going to head down there because it's more interesting and ironic to do it on the steps of our literal Capitol building. And I will see you there. Discovered I can use my bike as a tripod, though I look like I'm really short compared to you now because I'm kneeling. But as we headed here, we fell upon some sort of possibly non-profit event. They're doing Thanksgiving turkey and that sort of stuff. Denver's awesome. Okay, welcome back to the quiet part. I don't know what episode this is going to be, but today's topic is actually somewhat out of left field, but I promise it is somewhat related. I recently fell upon something called the Guide to Simple Sabotage, which is a CIA document from the 1940s during the Second World War. The CIA needed to train as many people as possible to be as good as possible at destroying movements and organizations broadly, whether it be a social movement, a political movement. And in today's episode, we'll be talking about the education system. And this video is in no way some sort of conspiracy, because we're not talking about this as if there are conscious individuals or leaders in the education system or any political movement that are properly intending to sabotage things. Instead, we're going to be talking about how social movements sort of internally sabotage themselves and how corporations can consciously try to make that happen anyway. During this reading, I was uncomfortable, to say the least, as I realized that the things I were reading were things that happen every day in every business and every organization and social movement in the world. Most of the original reading, this actual document that got declassified, is just all about literal sabotage, how to ruin machines and cars, which is cool and interesting. But we're going to be talking mostly about Section 11, which is called General Interference with Organizations and Productions. And the second you start reading, you get really annoyed and unhappy because you quickly realize that these are things that are happening in every social movement the world over all the time. If you look at subsection 5, it states, to be an effective saboteur in a social movement, you should haggle over precise wordings of communications, minutes, and resolutions. This is the classic leftist and right-wing problem of fighting over specific language. Whenever people get too dedicated to figuring out what a certain word means, it just takes all energy away from that given movement. Even with present conflicts involving what's going on in the Middle East, people are constantly fighting and trying to go over the semantics of the language of are we talking about civilians? Are we talking about armed militants? And obviously any rational person agrees that that's pointless. Human lives are human lives. But people love to fight over the semiotics of this sort of stuff to take power away from any social movement. And that's just in the political sense. Today, I mostly want to talk about how the education system does this and how it gets in the way of it actually working. Why else is the public so discontent with education, if not precisely because it doesn't work correctly? So let's look at some more of these examples from Section 11, General Interference with Organizations and Production. Insist on doing everything through channels. Again, so these are things that you could train a saboteur to do to take energy from the social movement. Insist on doing everything through channels. Never permit shortcuts to be taken. Section 2, make speeches. Talk as frequently as possible and at great lengths. Illustrate your points with long anecdotes and pointless comments. Section 3, when possible, refer all matters to committees for further study and consideration. Attempt to make committees as large as possible so that they're inefficient. Refer back to matters that were previously decided upon in previous meetings and reopen them so you need to talk about them. Section 7, this one's hilarious. Advocate caution, be reasonable, and urge your fellow conferees to be reasonable, and avoid haste, which may result in embarrassment or difficulties later on. Each of these things is something that every business conference, every professional development meeting, every meeting on the face of education and broadly every social movement, they spend so much time fighting over language and having conferences that could have been emails that efficiency is completely taken away from the entire goal, right? All the steam is taken out of this stuff because leaders, whether it be consciously or not, are like, yeah, I think we could just do another meeting for this. I'm sure that won't waste our time or be inefficient. So here's the subsection for managers and supervisors. Tell me if you've heard this before. Demand written orders. Misunderstand orders. Ask endless questions or engage in long conversations about orders. Do everything possible to delay the delivery of instructions. Even though parts of an order may be ready beforehand, don't deliver it until it's completely ready. Section 6. In making work assignments, always sign out the most unimportant jobs first and save the truly important ones for last. This is exactly what is happening in the American education system and probably in every social movement that you could possibly think of. When people spend too much time trying to organize things and fight over language and they don't prioritize the actual goal of the movement force, when these priorities aren't aligning with the actual social movement, it falls apart. And the CIA literally mastered the method of making those movements fall apart. We've done this, the US has done this to like 20 different countries, and it worked every single time. And so the thing that I want to talk about today is, why are we not talking about the fact that we're letting people be inefficient? The U.S. education system sucks, but it's for a reason. It's because of the bureaucracy. And what I want to do is educate you today on how you can avoid that problem and how you can avoid falling into those same pit traps, those pitfalls. Towards the end of this document, it's really just truly hilarious how it exemplifies what bureaucracy is and how that kills movements. Multiply paperwork. Apply all regulations to the exact last letter. Pretend instructions are hard to understand and ask if they have to be repeated more than once. Do your work poorly and blame it on the tools and machinery or equipment. Have you ever heard a student, a teacher, or a business person say, well, the regulation's in my way, so there's nothing I can do? They do this all the time, and we just let it happen. Number 6, this is relevant to education. Never pass on your skill and experience to a less skillful worker. What a great way to kill a social movement. Misroute materials. Give lengthy and incomprehensible explanations when questioned. Have you ever spoken to a boss or a principal about an important issue that might be somewhat controversial, and all they give to you is a nothing burger with no true meaning behind what they're saying? These are all absolutely horrifying examples of ways that schools as organizations are utterly self-sabotaging. And so that's what I wanted to talk about today, is how does this happen in education? So for the next section, I'll give you a specific example, okay? And I really want to focus in that fighting over language, semiotics situation. In education, there's a really great example of wasted breath when it comes to language. And I'm not talking about English class or the learning of languages or multiple languages. I'm talking about how we use our language. Take, for example, if you're a teacher, you'll know what this is. What is a learning target? Well, a learning target, to explain this simply, because you're about to hear 20 other words for it, a learning target is the goal of a given lesson or unit of instruction. It's usually pretty specific, and it usually is kind of a planning tool for teachers so they can know what goal to reach. And it can be useful to students, too, if they can understand what it means. You'll see this written on a board somewhere in the classroom or spoken aloud by a teacher. But there's about 20 different words for it, all of which mean slightly the same thing and also not the same thing. So you have learning targets, learning objectives, okay? You have learning goals, you have content objectives, language objectives, and then you have content language objectives, and then you have content targets and content goals. And each of these words is the same word to one meaning or another. And yet, we don't have clarity on this language, and we debate over the semiotics and specificity of what it actually means, and we waste time for everyone involved in this system. I mean, take, for example, the fact that we have both 504 and IEP plans, which easily could be nested into each other. The language is important and specificity does matter, but more often than not, what we're talking about is what can we do to actually help these students as much as possible. And the more that movements and organizations fight over the semiotics of their language, fighting over the specific definitions of everything, we waste time and we make it harder to achieve our collective goal. And I do want to reinforce that a school is not a social or political movement. A school is just an organization with a goal, right, of educating as many people as possible, as effectively as possible, right? That's the goal of education, is to educate students. Well, the more we fight over language and the more time we waste on professional development and pointless meetings that could have been an email, the less time we have to actually achieve the goal that we set out to achieve in the first place. And so, the quiet part of today's episode is that education is self-sabotaging. But I don't want to ignore the important fact that at the end of the day, what really matters most isn't language, it isn't having another conference or checking another box. What matters is having boots on the ground, actually doing something. Are you working towards that goal? Are you doing things that matter? The language can distract from the actual goal. It can reinforce goals too, and in fact, that's how art and music works when it comes to social movements or organizational goals. But in education, the quiet part is we spend about the same amount of time wasting our time compared to actually using it correctly, because we fight over language, we misunderstand directions, and we constantly have to require multiple channels to go through for anything to happen. Here's another example of this that I want to reinforce. I am, of course, a science technology. I'm a STEM teacher, and I teach an environmental science course, an earth science course. And growing plants is pretty much one of the straightest ways to teach that subject, and it's really realistic and authentic and just a great way of doing it. Well, at my school, I wanted to build a greenhouse, right? The number of people I had to go through to get this to happen is more than fits on one hand. I had to make phone calls, go through emails, and then I had to go through email chains to get to a supervisor to then get not much of an answer. That is an example of self-sabotage. When our systems are so poorly made and have so many layers of regulation that we can't actually achieve the goal we set out to, that is self-sabotage. And whether it be some conspiratorial conscious choice that you think is happening, or more likely people just not thinking when they organize systems, it's in the way, and it's making it harder to actually teach. Well, so here's another beautiful example of this idea. If you look at the environmental movement, right, which I affiliate with, I like the solar punk movement. I love using it as a sort of worldview for imagining a better future as a scientist and science teacher. More often than not, these sort of microcosmic, these really small social movements tend to eat themselves alive from the inside out. And this happens with semiotics. It happens with people fighting over the specificity of language, of gatekeeping. Well, this isn't environmentally friendly, and this is environmentally friendly, and you shouldn't do this, and you should do this, and it has to be exactly this exact thing within this exact spacing. And I think, again, ironically, a content language objective or a learning target does ground people and allow them to have a shared goal. And I think social movements need to have shared goals, but they need to be principles, guiding principles and philosophies, as opposed to very specific policies. We can evaluate those individually, but we shouldn't kick someone out of the social movement just because they are interested in a policy that you particularly don't like. Is it going to help you achieve that ultimate goal? Then go for it and support it and work towards it. The CIA has discovered that the best way to kill a movement is to fight over these specific things, to get obsessed with the specificity of this language and exile certain people if they don't use the right word for that right thing. It shouldn't matter, because in the real life, when people are doing work, they're using philosophies and principles to guide them. They're not always asking themselves, oh, are we talking about permaculture versus this or that or this, or you could talk about people looking at aquaponics versus hydroponics versus aeroponics versus sandponics. In each of those subcategories or groups, sometimes debate over who's better. But the point is that we need all of these technologies. We need all of these ideas to guide us and help us actually do something that matters. Oh, well, solar panels, they require too much rare earth mineral mining. Oh, well, wind power can disturb certain populations. Oh, well, hydropower can only work in certain areas and may also disturb river populations. Wave power isn't really well put together yet. Each of these complaints just takes away from the fact that at the end of the day, if we are working towards improving the world and having a shared goal of making the world more sustainable, that's all that matters. Fighting over this specific language is the quickest way for us to lose, the quickest way for us to meet our death as a social movement and not see the change in the world that we want to. And this is echoed in education. So long as schools are fighting over their specific language of what they're doing, they are not going to effectively get to actually do what it is they care about. That is the quiet part. Schools are self-sabotaging, but it's not a conscious effort. It's a lot of people who are ignorant to the system and check out of it. And can I relate to them and understand that? Sometimes. But at the same time, if more people understand how to avoid this sort of thing, school systems will work better, and the public will have less of a reason to have less trust in these systems. That's the quiet part. Okay, welcome back. We got food. It was delicious. I'm back in front of the Capitol building, and I've had time to mellow with some of my thoughts and ideas, because this is one of those quiet part videos where, there's not a bunch of pre-research. It was just me complaining about systems. And as per usual, when I just complain about things, I like to occasionally propose solutions, right? But before that, I wanted to think of one more kind of point I wanted to make that I sort of realized as I continued thinking about this stuff. Is I talked previously about, and I'll say this consistently from now on, I talked about content language objectives. Most people call them learning targets. Learning targets and content language objectives are the same thing, but there's a million different words for it that are really unclear. And the irony, right? This is the most ironic realization, is that a content language objective is just a mission statement, right? A business's language objective or content objective is its mission statement. It's its goal and purpose, what it's trying to do. There's 1,000 words for this same thing in education, and the irony is that the point of a learning target or content language objective is to have a specific, measurable, and timely goal, a SMART goal, which is another ridiculous acronym. The goal is to have a clear goal, right? That you can't debate over or get lost on. It's when everyone has a shared vision of what the future looks like, you all can take steps to work towards that. So that was one more example of just the bitter irony of how language and social movements can kind of eat each other in sort of like a crossfire almost. Nah, I'm not good at speaking. Sometimes I'm not good at speaking. So there we have it. That's a great example of how language can kill a social movement. When people fight over language and they get too focused on, gatekeeping people from a shared goal that everyone actually probably has together. So it's not enough to just complain. What about solutions? What ideas do I think can help deal with this problem with any social movement? Not even just a leftist one, not even the goal of educating, not even a business's mission statement. What can you do to deal with these things? And the answer I actually think is really simple. Stop schoolifying everything. Social movements end up self-studying themselves, not in like a self-reflective way, not with the purpose of, oh, hey, did this method that we implemented not work? Well, what else could we do? It's not like that. It's fighting and gatekeeping. Hey, well, this definition is different from yours, and so you don't fit in with our social movement. We're going to kick you out of it. That sort of schoolifying and gatekeeping and elitism is what kills a social movement. In an academic setting, it's saying like, oh, well, my content objective is very different from your learning target. Those are different things. What? No, they're not. They're the same thing. They serve the same purpose. And when you fight over these things, you slow down progress towards the actual goal. In environmental science, again, you could talk about people, how they define, like, is this solar punk? Is this permaculture? Is this really sustainable? Is this not sustainable? You could take just a random person on the side of the road who's growing some spring onions in a plastic container, who's clearly doing something good and right, and be like, well, it's microplastics. And then it's like, what? Yes, we can, in an academic setting, have conversations and develop research on these topics and talk about whether or not we need to have new specific language invented for every possible microcosm. But when boots are on the ground, have a shared language. Have everyone agree on the same thing. And the irony is, I think in most social movements, and I will be political on this, pretty much everyone's problem is the government is bad at being egalitarian. Egalitarian is a really big word, but it's a specific word, and everyone agrees on it pretty much. People are equal and they should be treated equally. Almost every movement goes back to that simple fact that some one person or some group of people do not feel they're being treated in an egalitarian way. If we all just agree on that word, we can all be friends, right? We can stop fighting over, all the specific implementation and instead make our voices heard and use democracy for what it's supposed to be for, which is listening to the people's voices. But so long as those voices aren't united, and so long as there isn't a language by which to unite them, no one will hear anything other than chatter. So the quiet part in this case is actually literally loud. Speak up, have a shared language, and leave the academic part of researching your social movement to an academic setting. And when boots are on the ground, you've got to be moving. Okay. That was pretty good, wasn't it? Thoughts?